Okay, so I just wanted to run you through my first attempt at using one of Project Zero's thinking routines from the Making Thinking Visible group. So what I had done is I'd started with one of the core thinking routines here, and I'd chosen Circle of Viewpoints as the first one. It seems a very simple and easy to use routine, and it looks like this. So step one was brainstorm a list of different perspectives, and then step two takes students through these 3 bullet points. So I'm thinking of whatever the topic is from the viewpoint of, and then I think describe the topic from your viewpoint, be an actor, take on the character of your viewpoint. I particularly liked that because I felt it really placed the students in the shoes of whatever it is that you were talking about. So it really kind of encouraged students to think more deeply. And then the last step was a question that they had from that viewpoint. So I was really looking forward to seeing what this threw up. So the context was this. So we were starting a new unit. This is a songwriting unit that students were expected to write their own song. We had a starter activity, which was this. We had 3 numbers on the board. We had 33.7 million people went to concerts or festivals in 2019. £5.2 billion contributed to the UK economy last year by the music industry, and 159.3 billion was the number of songs streamed in the UK in 2022. So the point of this was to try and get students thinking that, as a whole, the UK population is happy to give up their time and their money in order to enjoy music. So the question was, why is music important to so many people? And that led to some really interesting discussion. So this was 211. So we had answers in the following categories. So helps people feel less stressed, related to mental health, helps people connect to emotion, helps people feel a sense of belonging, helps people make connections, particularly with regard to friendship groups, and provides entertainment. That led us on to the Circle of Viewpoints activity. So I had a piece of music, and that could be any piece of music that was on the centre of the board there, and a bunch of different arrows around the outside. And students had to come up with this type of suggestion here. So these are my examples in the bubbles around the outside. So we had a really interesting discussion. So we were able to come up with a load of different roles. Students managed to get virtually all of the ones that I'd put there as examples, plus a few extras. So another good one that they came up with was album artist, which I thought was really insightful. And then we went through what those roles would do, and what would be involved, what the responsibilities were, and how you might go about doing a good job within that role. So it was a really interesting discussion about industry. So once we'd done that, that led us on to the next part of the activity, part 2. So I added an additional bullet point from the ones that we covered in the Circle of Viewpoints PDF. So I added in the section on here, which is my priorities are. So I wanted students to be able to see if students could recall what the responsibilities were from the discussion that we'd had about each of the individual roles. So I am thinking of a piece of music from the viewpoint of one of the roles that we'd mentioned previously. Then I think describe the topic from your viewpoint. So what can you remember about that role? What were the important things? My priorities within that role, and then a question that I have from the viewpoint of someone who would be doing that role. So this was really good because it gave me a lot of insight into students' understanding of that roles and what they had taken away from the discussion. So one thing that I observed on the whole was that students did struggle even more than I expected with putting themselves into someone else's shoes. Even though we'd just been through what the responsibilities for each of these roles was, students were really hesitant to actually put themselves in the shoes of someone in that role. I think one of the challenges that they faced was that you had to explain to the rest of the class as if you were that person. So there was a slight acting element there. So a lot of students did find that quite intimidating, but I think it was a really important step. I think it was a really important process because it really forces you to connect with that role and everything that we've discussed, and sort of make those connections between the conversation that we've just had, and really gave me a real insight into who'd taken away what bits of information and how they were putting those bits of information together. I really feel like it was almost an assessment for learning technique where it gave me a really good, strong insight for the depth of understanding from even just a simple conversation that we'd had. It did take a lot longer than I anticipated. We had students, partly because they were hesitant to put themselves in that maybe slightly vulnerable situation of being asked to play a role. I think there were probably a little bit of nerves, but I think most of that was down to familiarity. I do feel like that's something that I could overcome with doing that routine a few times. So I wasn't too worried about that. I did feel like it was beneficial. In terms of the evaluation, yeah, I do think that gave me a better understanding of students' depth of learning, as I said, and it did feel like a good way to introduce the topic. It did take significantly longer. This was mainly supposed to be a sort of 15-minute starter activity and discussion, really, and it did end up taking most of a period. But as I said, I don't think that was wasted time. I feel like this was beneficial for students to practice putting themselves in someone else's shoes. And the fact that, I mean, obviously these are music industry roles, but they're not specific to the music industry. You could apply very easily the same concept to job roles within any industry, and things like, promotions and advertising is pretty much universal. So yes, so gave me a much better understanding. It enabled me to work out who was feeling slightly more nervous or slightly more confident, who had taken away what bits of key information, who was better at assimilating what the key bits of information were from the discussion that we'd had previously. And it also gave me a little bit of insight into how I might structure this discussion, which is a fairly regular discussion that I have with students in a lot of different topics in terms of what roles there are that contribute to this. How I might structure that more so that students are better able to take away what the key roles are for each of these jobs, which I think is important in terms of students having a good understanding of industry in general. Okay, thanks so much for listening.